I thought I knew my wife. Until the afternoon I came home early with her favorite pastries, and found her in bed with 3 strangers. Instead of losing my mind, I set a trap they'd never forget. This isn't just a story of betrayal. It's how I took back control of my life without firing a single shot. My name is Leo Thompson. By the time I turned 38, I'd built everything I thought mattered. A thriving resort chain along the Florida coast, a reputation as a man who never cut corners, and a marriage I believed was solid. When I met Claire, I was still in my 20s, working endless hours to prove myself. She came into my life during those early years, when the stakes felt impossibly high and the future was nothing but ambition. Back then, I thought success was measured by how much you could give the person you loved. I was determined to make sure she never had to worry about anything. We married after 2 years of dating, and I kept my promise. Weekend trips to Key West, front-row concert tickets, dinners at the kind of restaurants you had to book months ahead, whatever she wanted, I found a way to make it happen. I never imagined any of it would become the backdrop to betrayal. For a long time, I'd convinced myself Claire was happy. She played her role with practiced ease, smiling when we went out, supporting me when work demanded late nights, appearing at every charity gala as though we were a team. I was so sure we were. I missed the signs, or maybe I didn't want to see them. Some of my friends warned me that too much comfort can erode a relationship. That when everything comes too easily, people look for problems to fix or excitement to fill the silence. But I brushed those ideas aside. If you'd asked me a year ago, I'd have sworn up and down that Claire and I were unbreakable. On the day everything fell apart, I was coming off a stretch of back-to-back investor meetings. My company had just closed a deal to acquire 2 boutique hotels in the Carolinas, and I was running on adrenaline and too little sleep. That Friday, my last appointment was canceled at the last minute. For once, I had an open afternoon. I remember thinking how rare it was to get a few free hours. Instead of heading to the gym or catching up on emails, I decided to surprise Claire. It had been a while since I'd done anything spontaneous, and I figured she'd appreciate it. There was this small bakery she loved in Coral Gables, the kind of place that sold pastries you couldn't find anywhere else. I picked up a box of her favorites and thought about how I'd walk in, catch her off guard, and remind us both that we were still the same couple who used to stay up talking until sunrise. I didn't call ahead. I wanted it to feel genuine, not scheduled like everything else in our lives. The first moment I felt something was wrong was in the parking garage. Claire's car was there, but I didn't recognize the 3 other vehicles parked beside it. Expensive imports, all lined up as if they belonged there. My stomach tensed, but I told myself I was overthinking. Still, I pulled out my phone and checked the building's security camera feed. After a break-in the year before, I'd installed extra cameras for peace of mind. I tapped through the footage and saw 3 men entering the elevator. No delivery bags, no work uniforms, just strangers heading to my floor. Even then, part of me wanted to believe there was some harmless explanation. Maybe she'd invited friends over. Maybe they were contractors. My mind scrambled for any reason that didn't involve betrayal. But when I stepped off the elevator, the condo was too quiet. A heavy sort of silence pressed against my ears. I put the pastry box down on the hallway table and moved further inside. That was when I heard it, a muffled laugh coming from the bedroom. 4 voices, hers and 3 others. Strange, the way your brain tries to protect you in moments like that. For a few seconds, I just stood there, listening, unable to process what I was hearing. Then my body took over. I walked to the bedroom door and eased it open, just enough to see. There she was, the woman I'd trusted with everything. She didn't look ashamed. She didn't look trapped. She looked comfortable, laughing with them so casual it made something in my chest twist. That was the moment I knew I'd been living in a story I didn't write. I closed the door without making a sound. My heart was thudding so hard I thought they'd hear it. But no one noticed. They were too busy entertaining themselves to think about the man who paid for the roof over their heads. I walked back down the hall, past the pastries I'd bought, past the framed photos of a life I thought was real. Each step felt surreal, like I was moving underwater. When I reached my office, I opened the safe where I kept a handgun. I'd never had to use it before. I didn't plan to use it now, But I wanted them to understand this wasn't a joke. There were consequences to walking into another man's home and taking what didn't belong to you. I checked the chamber to be sure it was unloaded. My hands were steady, which surprised me. In that moment, I didn't feel rage. I felt something colder, resolve. They thought I was hours away, too busy with work to notice. They'd underestimated me. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a screaming scene or a violent outburst. That would make it easier for them to call me unhinged, to twist the story into something it wasn't. No, I intended to end it on my terms. And I would. I left the office and walked back through the condo with the gun held low by my side. Even though it wasn't loaded, its weight reminded me that I was the one in control of what would happen next. The hallway was still silent except for the occasional laugh drifting from the bedroom. It struck me how careless they were, how certain that no one would catch them. That certainty made something in me settle. If they were this sure of themselves, then they deserved to be surprised. I stepped into the elevator and rode it down to the garage. My SUV was parked closest to the entrance, blocking in all three unfamiliar cars. I knew from experience that no tow truck would show up quickly on a Friday afternoon, especially in our crowded building. I positioned my vehicle crosswise behind theirs and locked the doors. They weren't going anywhere until I decided to let them. For a moment, I stood there and thought about what I'd just seen. My mind wanted to replay the images over and over, but I forced myself to stay focused. I had to stay clear-headed. Reacting in anger would give them power over me. I refused to hand it to them. When I got back upstairs, I walked onto the balcony. The late afternoon sun was sinking toward the skyline, casting long shadows over the water. I dialed Claire's number, and she picked up after the first ring. "Hey, sweetheart," I said evenly. "Plans changed. My meeting got canceled. I'll be home in 10 minutes. There was a pause, then a short laugh that sounded forced. "That's great. I'll see you soon." I could picture her face as she realized what was about to happen. But I didn't let myself imagine too much. I hung up without another word. I turned back into the living room and set the gun on the kitchen counter. My heart was beating harder now, but not out of fear. I was preparing myself to finish what I'd started. The minutes stretched. I heard movement in the bedroom, hurried footsteps and whispers. A door slammed. Cabinets opened and shut. I let them scramble. By the time I walked down the hall again, Claire was in the kitchen. She looked like she'd tried to make herself presentable in a hurry. Her eyes moved immediately to the gun. I could see her trying to figure out if I was dangerous. "You're early," she said. "Yes," I replied. "I thought it'd be nice to surprise you." She opened her mouth, but no words came. Behind her, the three men emerged one by one. None of them met my eyes. One of them, a tall man with a shaved head, shifted his weight as if he was about to say something. I gestured at the counter. "I bought pastries," I said. My voice was level. "But I guess you're not hungry." The tall one cleared his throat. "Look, man, this isn't." I cut him off with a flat stare. "Don't bother. I saw everything." His gaze flicked to the gun, then back to me. He held up his hands slightly, as if to signal he didn't want trouble. I let the silence drag out until I was sure none of them had the nerve to speak again. "You three," I said finally, "are going to leave. You'll find your cars blocked in. You can wait outside for a tow truck, or call a ride. I don't care." Claire made a small sound in her throat, like she was about to cry. I ignored her. The second man, wearing a gold watch, looked offended. "You can't just lock us in here." I almost laughed. "I already did." He opened his mouth again, but one of the others grabbed his arm and shook his head. They understood that I was done listening. I picked up the gun, turned it in my hand to show them it wasn't pointed at anyone, and set it back down. "I'm not going to hurt you, but you're going to leave this apartment right now." No one argued after that. They shuffled toward the door, gathering their clothes and belongings. Their exit was clumsy and awkward, which felt appropriate. I watched them go without saying another word. When the door finally shut behind them, I looked at Claire. She was standing in the same spot, her face pale, arms crossed tight over her chest. For a moment, she tried to compose herself. Leo, she began, her voice trembling. I don't, I said. She swallowed hard. Can we talk? I shook my head. You've had plenty of time to talk. I'm done listening. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I didn't feel any sympathy. Not after what I'd seen. I reached into the hall closet and pulled out the largest duffel bag we owned. I set it in front of her. You'll pack your things. Tonight, you'll leave your key on the counter. Her mouth fell open. You're serious? Yes. Leo, please. I made a mistake. No. I interrupted, my tone flat. A mistake is forgetting a birthday. This was a choice. One you repeated. You don't get to rewrite it. She pressed her hands to her face. I didn't care whether she cried. My mind was already working through the logistics, changing the locks, calling my attorney, arranging to have her things sent wherever she ended up. After a few seconds, she dropped her hands. What do you want me to say? She asked in a whisper. Nothing, I said. I don't need anything from you. For a while, we stood there in the kitchen, neither of us speaking. It struck me how quiet everything was, how little there was left to say. When she finally moved, she picked up the bag and walked toward the bedroom. She didn't look back. I waited until I heard the door close behind her. Then I sat at the kitchen island, took a slow breath, and felt a kind of calm I hadn't known in years. Everything I thought I needed, her affection, her approval, was gone. And in its place was something simpler, clarity. I wasn't sure what came next, but I knew it would start without her. Claire spent the next hour moving through the condo, packing her belongings into the duffel bag and 2 suitcases. I stayed in the kitchen, watching the hallway. I didn't want her to think she could pretend this was a misunderstanding we'd work through later. At one point, she tried again to speak. She came to the doorway, her voice strained. Leo, I know you hate me right now, but you have to understand, I never planned. I held up a hand. Stop. You can explain this to your lawyer, not to me. She looked like she might say more, but in the end she turned away. That was the last time she tried to justify herself. When she finally wheeled her bags to the door, she paused with her hand on the handle. I waited, expecting some final plea or apology, but she only stood there a moment, then stepped out without looking back. I heard the door close, and the lock clicked into place. I stayed where I was, breathing slowly. There was no sense of relief. Not yet. Just a strange emptiness, like I'd been hollowed out. Eventually, I stood and walked to the bedroom. The bed was still unmade, the covers tangled. I stripped the sheets and carried them straight to the laundry room. I didn't want any trace of what had happened to linger. Afterward, I took out my phone and called my attorney. It was late in the day, but he picked up on the second ring. Leo? He said, sounding concerned. Everything all right? No, I said. I need to file for divorce. Today. He was silent for a second, then cleared his throat. Understood. Are you safe? Yes. All right. I'll start the paperwork tonight. We'll have something ready to serve her within 48 hours. Make sure it's clear she leaves with the minimum she's entitled to, I said. No more. I'll see to it. I ended the call and set the phone on the counter. Then I walked back to the balcony and looked out at the lights along the shoreline. The familiar view felt different, as if the place itself had been contaminated by what I'd seen. I knew I'd have to face questions. People in our social circles who would want to know what happened, who would pretend to care while collecting gossip to share over dinner parties. But I didn't care. Let them talk. The next morning, the calls started early. First from Claire. I didn't answer. Then from her sister, who left a message begging me to hear Claire out. I deleted it without listening to the end. By noon, the building manager called to inform me the 3 men had returned, trying to retrieve the cars I'd blocked in. I'd already arranged for a tow company to handle it. When I checked the security feed, I saw them standing in the garage, shifting uncomfortably as the drivers hooked their vehicles to the trucks. Their presence didn't bother me. If anything, seeing them waiting under the fluorescent lights, powerless to do anything but watch, made me feel a small flicker of satisfaction. Around 3 in the afternoon, my attorney arrived in person to have me sign the divorce documents. He looked tired but focused. I included a statement about her infidelity, he said, tapping the folder. She'll have limited claims to spousal support. Good, I said. Do you want to add anything about those men? Witness affidavits, statements for the record? No, I paused. I don't want to give them any more space in my life. He nodded. Understood. After he left, I sat in the living room with the papers in front of me. Each page was a reminder that the last decade had ended in a single afternoon. I signed them all without hesitation. The following week was a blur. Claire moved in with her sister. She tried to call me again and again, but I never picked up. My office phone rang with polite inquiries from acquaintances pretending to check on me. I ignored most of them. At work, I was more focused than I'd been in years. For the first time, I didn't feel compelled to rush home, to keep up the appearance of a perfect marriage. My team noticed. They thought I was energized by the new acquisitions. Only my closest friend, Brian, knew the truth. He came by one evening carrying takeout and 2 beers. We sat on the balcony, eating in silence for a while. Finally, he looked over and said, "I know you don't want to talk about it, but you did the right thing." "I know," I said. "You're handling this better than most people would." "I don't feel like I'm handling it," I admitted. "It's like I'm on autopilot." "That's better than tearing your life apart over someone who didn't respect you." He was right. Still, there was a dull ache I couldn't shake. A sense that I'd invested everything in someone who saw me as a convenience. A few days later, I received an email from Claire's attorney. She accepted the divorce terms without contest. There was no message from her, no last plea or explanation. I felt strangely relieved that she hadn't tried. The paperwork would be finalized in a matter of weeks. After that, we'd have no reason to speak again. One night, I stood in the kitchen where she'd once tried to justify herself. I realized I didn't feel hate. What I felt was simpler disinterest. She was no longer part of my story. For years, I'd believed that a marriage could survive anything as long as you worked hard enough. That idea had kept me tied to a person who'd already checked out long before I caught her. I saw that now, and knowing it freed me more than any revenge could have. The weeks after Claire moved out passed in measured, deliberate steps. Every day, I woke early, went for a run, and arrived at the office before most of my team. The rhythm of my work became something steady I could rely on. Without her presence in the condo, the place felt larger, but not in a way that was lonely. More like the space had been returned to me, and I could decide what filled it. My attorney called to confirm the court date that would finalize the divorce. There was no contest from Claire, no demand for mediation. She signed everything without a fight. It was clear she wanted to move on as badly as I did. In our social circle, the news spread quickly. At first, I received calls and texts from people acting shocked. A few tried to hint that I should have been more understanding, that maybe Claire had been unhappy. I didn't respond to any of it. I knew what I'd seen. I didn't owe anyone an explanation. One afternoon, Brian stopped by my office to check in. He looked at me across my desk. "You know, you're handling this better than I expected," he said. "Better than I expected too," I told him. "She tried to call me," he added carefully. "I didn't pick up. Figured you'd want your space." "Thank you." He nodded and left it at that. I appreciated that he didn't press for details or try to talk me into forgiving her. By the end of that month, the divorce decree was signed by the judge. Claire was officially out of my life. She kept a few personal items, but almost everything else stayed with me, including the condo. The finality of it was strange at first. 4 years we'd been linked in everything: bank accounts, schedules, obligations. Now I was free of all of it. The 3 men she'd been with never reappeared. I'd expected some attempt at contact or some cowardly message trying to explain themselves, but none of them had the nerve. The night their cars were towed out of the garage had been the end of it. A few weeks later, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Claire had moved to a small rental north of the city. She wasn't working, and she spent most days at her sister's house. That was all I knew and all I cared to know. I put the condo on the market. Even though it was mine now, I didn't want to keep living in a place that had become a monument to betrayal. A real estate agent walked through with me, clipboard in hand, praising the view and the layout. I listened, detached. The sooner it sold, the better. At the office, I focused my energy on expanding operations. We were in the middle of acquiring a chain of properties in the Carolinas, and I threw myself into negotiations, traveling back and forth to finalize contracts. My staff noticed the change. They said I seemed more driven. In reality, I was just filling every hour, so there was no space for regret. One afternoon, I received a letter from Claire. It was handwritten, the envelope addressed in her familiar script. I set it on my desk without opening it. Days passed before I finally tore it open and read what she'd written. She apologized in broad terms, said she was ashamed, that she didn't expect forgiveness but hoped I'd find peace. She didn't try to explain what she'd done. No excuses. Only a final line that stuck with me. I was selfish. You deserved more than I could ever be. I folded the letter and put it away. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. With Claire gone, I started to see how much of myself I'd neglected over the years. I began therapy at Brian's recommendation. At first, I resented the idea that talking to a stranger would help. But over time, it did. My therapist helped me see the patterns I'd ignored, how I'd convinced myself that providing everything material would guarantee loyalty, how I'd ignored the distance growing between us. It wasn't about blaming myself for her choices, but it was about understanding why I'd stayed blind to them. A few months later, the condo finally sold. On the last evening before I turned over the keys, I walked through each room. I thought I might feel regret, but instead I felt something closer to relief. I locked the door one final time and left without looking back. I rented a smaller place downtown, a clean slate with no memories attached. No shared closets or drawers. No echoes of a life that had ended the moment I opened that bedroom door. At work, our expansion succeeded. The new properties were folded into the company, and profits rose. My board congratulated me on the growth. Some of them assumed the success was a reaction to the divorce. In a way, it was. I had nothing left to distract me. Occasionally, people asked if I was seeing anyone. I always said no. The truth was I wasn't ready. Trust didn't come back overnight. I wasn't in a hurry to pretend it did. The first time I realized I was okay came on a quiet Sunday morning. I woke up alone in the new place, made coffee, and sat by the window watching the city wake up. For the first time, I didn't feel the weight of betrayal. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel anything toward her at all. I just felt calm. Surprised me how ordinary that moment was. No big revelation, no dramatic sense of closure. Just the simple understanding that I'd survived. That was the consequence Claire never expected. She thought she'd broken something in me that couldn't be repaired. But all she'd done was clear space for something better I hadn't even imagined yet. After I settled into my new place, the pace of life slowed in a way that felt deliberate. For years, I'd tied my identity to being a husband, a provider, someone who could be counted on to hold everything together. When that role vanished, it forced me to look at what was left. I kept my schedule full with work and therapy. Some evenings, I would walk through downtown Miami, just to remind myself that I didn't have to report to anyone anymore. If I wanted to stay out late or travel on a whim, I could. It was an unfamiliar freedom, and at first it felt like I was doing something wrong. Gradually, it became normal. My friends adjusted too. At first, they were cautious around me, careful not to bring up Claire's name or mention anything about marriage. But as time passed, they stopped treating me like someone who needed special consideration. I appreciated that more than I could say. A few months after the divorce was final, Brian convinced me to attend a business retreat in Napa Valley. He said it would be good for me to get away, to be around people who weren't connected to what had happened. I agreed mostly to keep him from worrying, but in the end, it turned out to be the right choice. The retreat was held at a small vineyard with conference facilities. Most of the attendees were entrepreneurs, investors, and consultants. The schedule was packed with workshops and networking sessions, but in the evenings, everyone gathered on the patio to talk over glasses of wine. That's where I met Hannah. She was a marketing director for a chain of restaurants, there to pitch a partnership. The first time we spoke, it wasn't anything profound. She asked if the seat next to me was taken, then introduced herself. She didn't seem to recognize my name, which I found refreshing. Over the next few days, we kept running into each other. Sometimes by accident, sometimes because I found myself looking for her in the crowd. She was direct in a way that I wasn't used to. When she asked questions, she listened to the answers instead of thinking about what to say next. On the third evening, we ended up walking the rows of grapevines as the sun set. She asked me if I'd ever been married. I paused before answering. I said finally. It didn't end well. She didn't press for details, just nodded and said, "I'm sorry." Then she changed the subject, and I was grateful she didn't treat me like a project that needed fixing. That night, I realized how different it felt to talk to someone who didn't carry any expectations about who I should be. After the retreat ended, we kept in touch. Calls turned into video chats, then plans to meet again. But I didn't rush it. I made sure every step forward felt right. The experience with Claire had taught me that trust isn't something you give away just because you want to believe the best about someone. It's built in small, steady increments. At the same time, I knew I couldn't let the past dictate every choice I made. If I wanted any chance at something real, I had to accept that risk was part of it. When Hannah eventually came to Miami for work, we met for dinner. The conversation was easy, but different than before. There was an undercurrent of possibility, something neither of us needed to define right away. At the end of the evening, she said, "You seem like someone who's learned a lot the hard way." "I have," I admitted. She looked at me steadily. "Do you still believe in second chances?" It was a fair question. For a long time I hadn't, but as I sat there, I realized that refusing to believe in them meant holding on to bitterness I no longer felt. "Yes," I said. "I think I do." After she left, I walked back to my condo feeling lighter. Not because I thought I'd found a replacement for what I'd lost, but because I finally understood I didn't need one. My life wasn't missing a piece. It was simply moving in a different direction. A few weeks later, I joined a therapy session where my counselor asked me to describe what I'd taken away from everything that happened. I thought about it for a while before answering. "I used to think loyalty was automatic if you provided enough," I said. "But now I know you can't buy integrity, and you can't force someone to care. All you can do is be clear about who you are and trust that the right person will respect it." He nodded. "And what about forgiveness?" "I don't hate her," I said honestly. "I don't think about her most days. That feels like enough." He smiled a little. "That's usually what it looks like when you've moved on." Later that afternoon, I walked along the waterfront by myself. The air smelled like salt and sun-warmed concrete. As I watched the boats drift past, it struck me that no one was waiting at home, and that felt fine. Sometimes, people imagine closure as a big moment, a dramatic conversation or a revelation that ties everything up neatly. In reality, it came quietly for me. It was just the absence of pain, the understanding that I was whole again, even if it had taken longer than I wanted. When I finally locked the door to my old life, it didn't feel like a loss. It felt like making room for something better I hadn't defined yet. That was the real ending. Not revenge or public humiliation, just peace. If anyone asked what I learned, I'd tell them this: betrayal doesn't define you. It only shows you where the real foundation of your life begins. And if you're willing to rebuild, it's possible to create something stronger than what you lost.